Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. We had a fantastically interesting webinar sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger of China Thursday of last week, in which three of our preeminent authorities came together to talk about the challenge of deterring the war that the Chinese Communist Party seems increasingly intent on taking from the unrestricted, non-kinetic kind that they've been engaged in for decades against us into a new and violent form, a very much kinetic kind of warfare. To discuss that issue, reprise a bit of the most important findings of this webinar, and recap some of his important contributions to it, I'm very pleased to have with us Captain James Fanell, United States Navy retired. In the course of a very distinguished career in naval intelligence, he rose through the ranks to become the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And since he left his duty station there, has been continuing to contribute mightily through programs like ours of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, of which I'm proud to say he is a member, to illuminate the kinds of problems, the threats that he saw coming and warned about during his time in uniform. Captain Fanell, welcome back to Securing America. It is always a red letter day when you are in the house, sir, virtually at least.
Thanks, Frank. I'm glad to be back. Appreciate your inviting me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let me ask you about one of the most important takeaways of this webinar, Jim, I think, and that was that the buildup that the Chinese are engaged in the Western Pacific specifically, naval, missiles, aircraft, space, and the like, is now creating conditions under which they could have a decisive advantage over our own forces there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Frank, I mean, for the last 25 years, the People's Liberation Army, across the various services, that, as you mentioned, especially in the naval, in the rocket forces, and the air forces, that the Chinese Communist Party has been building them up for 25 years. And for most of that period, we in the West kind of just ignored it or dismissed it. Some even apologized for it and said, well, this is natural because they're a big country. But now they have the wherewithal to be able to exert military options that they didn't have before. For instance, in the South China Sea, if you go back to when I was in uniform, I retired 7 years ago, but when I was serving in the Western Pacific with the 7th Fleet or on the Kitty Hawk, you know, the United States Navy had the advantage of being the most predominant Navy that was operating inside that first island chain of the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And now here we are 20 years later, and China essentially is the dominant military force inside the first island chain, outnumbering the U.S. Navy probably on an average of 10-1 in the South China Sea on any given day.
Wow.
We operate there and do some large exercise with carrier strike groups, with our own, with expeditionary strike groups, with our allies like Japan. But then we do it for a week and then we go home. And the Chinese are there. They built 3 major bases, naval bases, that they're the size of Pearl Harbor, and they're operating from these bases, ships, aircraft, and they have military equipment there to shoot long-range surface-to-surface missiles that can essentially control the entrance or the operations in the South China Sea. So we've seen a shift in the balance of power over the last 25 years where our presence has remained in the Western Pacific with the 7th Fleet, roughly on the order of 60 to 70 ships, whereas China's gone from essentially no ships 25 years ago, no real blue water Navy ships, to over 350. And they're all concentrated in the Western Pacific. Our smaller Navy, large total Navy, is around the world. So again, we're at a military disadvantage right now in naval, in air, in strategic rockets. They've built the cyber initiative with the Strategic Support Force. They're putting satellites 40 to 50 satellites in space every year, and those are all in some form or fashion, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, subordinate to the PLA and providing them, intelligence about the location of U.S. forces in the region.
Yes. Jim Fanell, we had, in addition to your good self, Stephen Mosier, the author of Bully of Asia, and Dr. Bradley Thayer, the author of several important books, including one about Han centrism and the sort of racist impetus behind a lot of China's ambitions. The three of you agreed not only that an attack by China seems now imminent, but that it might involve attacks against our own assets, perhaps personnel and territory even. Talk us through that calculation, if you would, please, Jim.
Right. In the PLA's doctrine for conducting what they've talked about as a short, sharp war, while applied to the Senkakus, that's clearly the way they're thinking about taking Taiwan. And to do that, they know that they have what they call counter-intervention strategy, which is to keep the U.S. from being able to come to the aid of Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So the PLA wants to be able to strike quickly, like lightning, and get at Taiwan through a variety of means of air, naval, and rocket attacks, and then launch an invasion. And they want to be able to keep the U.S. forces at bay. Well, one way to do that is to attack our forces while they're in port in Japanese ports, whether it's in Yokosuka, with where our Seventh Fleet, majority of our Seventh Fleet ships are at, or down in Sasebo, where amphibious ships are at, or in Kadena, where our U.S. Air Force largely operates out of, or even in Misawa, up in close to Hokkaido. So it's very much in part of their strategy would be to attack our forces to prevent them from being able to come into the fight. And we know that's true, just even if you don't believe that. We had physical evidence we saw in the deserts of central China in 2012. We saw mock-ups of Yokosuka Naval Base, where my ships, the ships that I served on, it had a mock-up of those ships and the outline of the port, the exact dimensions of Yokosuka Navy Base, and they were training their ballistic missiles to launch into space, turn on a sensor, and be able to find that and attack it at supersonic speeds. So we know that this is what their plan would be. And there's a lot of people, though, that still try to say, oh, they wouldn't do that. They just try to keep it confined to Taiwan. But when, the Communist Party would prefer not to use military force like they did to take Scarborough Shoal in 2012 or to build these 7 islands in the South China Sea. They did it all without firing a shot. And they'd like to be able to get Taiwan that way. But if it comes to the point where they say we can't get it any other way and we're on a timeline to get it, they're going to use all force and they're going to be all in, and they're not going to risk taking an attack just on Taiwan and risking that the United States and our allies like the Quad could come in and disrupt it. They're not going to risk that when they finally decide to use military force. So we have to anticipate that we're going to be the brunt of that attack. They've also built DF-21D, DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles that are designed specifically to find our carriers and our big deck amphibs and to destroy them at sea. Yeah. From ranges from 1,000 to 2,000 miles from our coastline.
A clue of their intentions in that regard is they've also been building out those outlines of the carrier, vessels and their accompanying surface combatants. Very little is being left to the imagination here, and we fail to recognize it, let alone address it as we must at our extreme peril. We're going to talk more on the other side of a very short break with Captain James Fanell about specifically what it is we must be doing in the face of these very strong signs of an impending Chinese attack against us, as well as Taiwan. That and more, straight ahead.